I stood at the kitchen island staring at a piece of heavy stock paper that made absolutely no logical sense. The morning sun was streaming through the leaded glass windows of the home my wife and I had spent 30 years restoring, illuminating the bold black ink on the page. It was a formal welcome letter and the first billing statement from a company called Apex Funding. According to the document in my hands, I was the proud recipient of a newly originated home equity loan. The principal balance was $250,000. The property secured by this massive debt was my own address. The first monthly payment of $2,100 was due in exactly 14 days. There was only one problem. I had never applied for a loan. Our home had been completely paid off for 5 years. But what made my blood run instantly cold, what made the edges of my vision blur with a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline, was a very specific memory from just 6 weeks earlier. My daughter Chloe had called me in an absolute panic about a massive national data breach. She had rushed over, sat at this very kitchen island, and insisted on helping me lock down my identity. I had watched her pull up the websites for Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I had watched her initiate a total security freeze on my credit profile. She had even insisted on generating the security pins and keeping them in her digital password vault, claiming it was safer because I was prone to losing pieces of paper. So how, in the name of God, does a $250,000 mortgage get underwritten, approved, and recorded against my property when my credit was supposedly locked in a vault? Before I go any further, let me pause and ask you something. I'd love to know where you are watching this from today, and I want you to tell me, have you ever been completely blindsided by a sudden impossible betrayal from someone you trusted with your life? Drop a comment below because I'm willing to bet I am not the only one who has felt the floor drop out from underneath them. My name is Rick. I'm 68 years old, living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've been married to my wife Elaine for 42 years. We aren't wealthy people. We never lived extravagantly, never bought fancy cars, and never took luxury vacations. What we did was work hard. For 35 years, I worked as a commercial real estate appraiser and title insurance underwriter. My entire professional life was spent in the dusty archives of county courthouses and later glaring at dual computer monitors tracing the complex chains of property ownership. I spent decades hunting down hidden lines, untangling fraudulent deeds, and spotting the tiny microscopic errors in loan documents that indicated someone was trying to pull a fast one on a bank or a buyer. That career afforded us a decent, quiet life. Our pride and joy was the 1920s craftsman home we bought back in 1988. When we purchased it, the roof was sagging, the plumbing was shot, and the beautiful original oak floors had been covered in cheap green shag carpet. Over the decades, Elaine and I brought it back to life. I sanded those floors myself on my knees. I rewired the fixtures. Elaine spent summers cultivating the massive hydrangea bushes that wrap around the wraparound porch. This house was more than just shelter. It was the physical manifestation of our marriage. It was our safe harbor. When I finally walked into the bank 5 years ago and paid off the last dime of our mortgage, it was the proudest day of my life. I knew that no matter what happened to my health or the economy, Elaine would always have a roof over her head. We had one child, our daughter Chloe. She is 34 now. We loved her fiercely, but if I'm being completely honest, Chloe always had a complicated relationship with effort. She was bright, capable, and charismatic, but she was entirely drawn to shortcuts. Whenever there was a hard way and an easy way, Chloe took the easy way, even if the easy way involved bending the rules. 4 years ago, she married a man named Todd. Todd called himself a serial entrepreneur, which I quickly learned was modern shorthand for a man who constantly starts businesses with other people's money and walks away right before the bankruptcy filing. He was a guy who wore expensive puffer vests, drove a leased luxury SUV that he could barely afford, and constantly used words like synergy, liquidity, and leverage at the dinner table. Chloe, meanwhile, worked as a senior loan processor for a mid-sized regional mortgage brokerage. She knew the lending industry inside and out, which made her and Todd a very dangerous combination of ambition and insider knowledge. The first real cracks in our family dynamic started showing about 3 months before the impossible loan statement arrived. Todd's latest venture, a boutique high-intensity fitness center in a trendy part of town, was hemorrhaging cash. The equipment leases were coming due, and his initial investors had vanished. One Sunday afternoon, Todd and Chloe sat Elaine and me down in our living room and made a highly polished pitch. They wanted a bridge loan. Specifically, they wanted me to take out a $100,000 line of credit against our house to float Todd's business for 6 months. I didn't even need to think about it. I told them absolutely not. I had already bailed Todd out of a poorly conceived real estate flipping scheme 2 years prior, losing $30,000 in the process. I explained calmly but firmly that our home was our retirement security, and I was never putting a lien on it again for any reason. Chloe's reaction was disturbing. She didn't just cry. She turned cold. She looked around our beautifully restored living room with a strange, calculating resentment, as if our financial stability was an insult to her struggles. She accused us of hoarding our wealth while our own daughter drowned. Elaine was in tears, but I held my ground. They left abruptly, and we didn't speak for a month. Then quite suddenly the ice thawed. Chloe called me on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding breathless and terrified. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you see the news about that massive healthcare data breach? Your provider was targeted. Millions of Social Security numbers are out there. You and Mom need to freeze your credit right now. I'm coming over." I was surprised by the sudden olive branch, but I knew data breaches were a real threat, so I welcomed her. When she arrived, she was all business. She opened her sleek silver laptop on the kitchen island. She asked me to sit beside her. "I'm going to handle this for you, Dad," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Seniors are the #1 target for identity theft. People can take out credit cards, loans, everything in your name. We're putting a hard freeze on all 3 bureaus." I watched the screen as she navigated the sites, but years of underwriting had taught me to read people just as well as I read documents. I noticed small, unusual things. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she tried to hide by keeping her wrists pressed hard against the edge of the laptop. She seemed overly eager to take control of the mouse whenever I reached for it. "I'll generate the unfreeze pins," she insisted, pulling up a secondary application. "I'm putting them in my encrypted password vault. That way, if you ever need to apply for something, you just call me. You know you always lose your passwords, Dad." It made sense on the surface, but there was a micro-expression on her face when the final screen confirmed the lock, a tiny, involuntary relaxation of her jaw, a flash of profound relief that didn't quite match the scenario of a helpful daughter. I also noticed that she briefly opened a tab for the county property tax portal, staring at my parcel number for a few seconds too long, before quickly closing it. I didn't say anything at the time. I just thanked her, assuming her anxiety was lingering from our previous argument. Now standing in the kitchen 6 weeks later with a $250,000 mortgage statement in my hand that afternoon took on a terrifying new context. I didn't panic. I didn't yell for Elaine. I took my reading glasses off, folded the letter, and slipped it into my leather briefcase. My professional instincts, dormant since my retirement, woke up like a bear coming out of hibernation. I knew exactly what to do, and more importantly, I knew what not to do. If you found out your own child might be forging your name to steal your home, what would you do? Would you confront them immediately? Call the police? Let me know in the comments. I can tell you that my first urge was to pick up the phone and demand answers. But I forced myself to stop. I drove downtown to the county register of deeds. I walked into the familiar climate-controlled records room that smelled faintly of old paper and ozone from the heavy-duty copiers. I logged onto the public access terminal and typed in my property parcel number. There it was, a newly recorded deed of trust filed just 12 days ago. I paid the $3 to print a certified copy of the document. I sat at a long wooden table and put on my glasses, reading the text with the trained eye of a man who had reviewed tens of thousands of these in his life. The document pledged my home as collateral to Apex funding. I turned to the final page, the signature block. There was my name, Richard M. Gable. The signature was a digital DocuSign imprint, but attached to it was a remote online notarization certificate. The digital notary stamp belonged to a man named Marcus Vance, commissioned in the state of Florida. I pulled out my phone and searched the notary registry. Marcus Vance was real, but how did a notary in Florida verify my identity over a webcam when I had never spoken to him? I looked closer at the IP address logged on the digital signature certificate. It was a local Michigan IP. The first real clue had dropped perfectly into place. This wasn't a faceless Russian hacker. This was an inside job, utilizing the modern conveniences of remote digital closings, a system my daughter used every single day at her mortgage brokerage. I walked out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, feeling a heavy, sickening weight settling in my chest. I couldn't just storm over to Chloe's house and accuse her. If I confronted her now, she would deny it. She would claim that the identity thieves from the data breach must have circumvented the credit freeze. She would cover her tracks, delete her digital logs, and paint me as a paranoid old man. Worse, she could immediately transfer the $250,000 into offshore or untraceable crypto accounts, leaving my house permanently encumbered by a massive lien. I had to stay completely quiet. I had to investigate this like a ghost. The next morning after Elaine left for her weekly bridge club, I made a phone call to a man named Steve. Steve was a retired forensic accountant I had worked with on several massive commercial real estate fraud cases in the early 2000s. He was brilliant, discreet, and possessed a healthy cynicism about human nature. We met at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. I slid the Apex funding statement and the printed deed across the laminate table. Steve drank his black coffee, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and studied the paperwork for 5 minutes in total silence. Apex Funding is a hard money lender, Steve finally said, tapping the letterhead. They don't sell their loans to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. They hold them in-house. They have much looser underwriting standards, which means they are faster, but they charge higher interest. They also rely heavily on automated remote closings. How did she bypass the credit freeze? I asked. Steve pulled a small tablet from his bag and logged into a proprietary database he still had access to. Give me your social security number. I recited it. He typed for a few moments, his brow furrowing. The freeze is currently active, Steve murmured. But look at this. He turned the screen toward me. Your file at TransUnion shows a temporary lift. A 48-hour unfreeze window initiated 4 weeks ago. It was triggered using the exact secure PIN you were assigned. Discovery number 2. Chloe hadn't just kept the pins to help me. She had kept them to control the gate. She unfroze my credit, ran the hard inquiry for the Apex loan, and let the freeze automatically re-engage, so I would never receive a secondary warning. Can you trace where the loan disbursement went? I asked, my voice tight. The title company would have wired the funds somewhere. Normally no, that requires a subpoena, Steve said. But I still consult for the underwriter that insured the specific title policy. Let me make a phone call. Steve stepped outside. I sat in the booth, watching the waitress refill my coffee, feeling entirely detached from reality. 10 minutes later, Steve returned. He didn't look triumphant. He looked deeply sympathetic. The funds didn't go to your bank account, Rick, Steve said softly. The $250,000 was wired to a commercial checking account belonging to an LLC. The entity is called Fulton Ventures. Fulton was the name of the street I lived on. Who is the registered agent for the LLC? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Todd, Steve replied. It was registered 3 weeks ago. The complete, horrifying picture finally locked into focus. Chloe had used her professional knowledge as a loan processor to perfectly package a fraudulent loan. She used a secondary market lender that allowed remote, digital notarization. She fed the Florida notary fake credentials, or perhaps paid him off. She unfroze my credit, secured the loan against my paid-off house, and directed the title company to wire the funds to her husband's newly minted shell company. The betrayal pierced me in a way I cannot adequately describe. It wasn't just the theft of money, it was the breathtaking psychological manipulation. That Sunday, Elaine, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding, invited Chloe and Todd over for dinner. I agreed to it because I needed to observe them. I needed to see how deep the rot went. They arrived carrying a bakery pie and an expensive bottle of wine. I watched my daughter walk into the house I had rebuilt with my own hands, the house she had just secretly mortgaged to the hilt, and hug her mother. She smiled, she laughed. Todd stood in my kitchen, swirling his wine glass, wearing a cashmere sweater purchased with my stolen equity, and had the absolute audacity to talk about his business turnaround. Things are really looking up, Rick, Todd said smoothly, leaning against the counter. We secured some private capital last month. It just goes to show, if you have a solid business plan, the market will reward you. I held my glass of iced tea, feeling the condensation drip against my fingers. Private capital, I repeated. That's wonderful, Todd. The terms must be steep, though. Oh, it's manageable, Todd smiled. You have to spend money to make money. Later during dinner, the conversation turned to the news. Chloe looked at me with an expression of pure, manufactured concern. Dad, did you see there was another data leak at a major bank? Aren't you so glad we locked down your credit? Honestly, the thought of someone taking out a loan in your name makes me sick. So many seniors lose their homes that way. I looked at my daughter. I looked into the eyes of the child I'd taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway outside. The child I'd walked down the aisle. She was sitting at my dining table eating the roast her mother had spent 4 hours preparing casually, bragging about the exact mechanism she had used to steal from us. In that precise moment, my grief evaporated. It was entirely burned away by a cold, quiet, and deeply calculated anger. I realized they didn't just want my money. They were perfectly willing to let Elaine and me be thrown out onto the street if Todd's business failed again and the hard money lender foreclosed. They viewed us as expendable assets. I wasn't just going to cut them off. I was going to let them walk willingly into a trap so flawlessly designed that they would never be able to threaten my wife's security again. The next day I went to work. I knew that a messy family lawsuit would drain my savings and destroy Elaine emotionally. If I just yelled fraud, Todd would immediately move the money out of the Fulton Ventures account and hide it in crypto or offshore, leaving me to fight a massive corporation over a forged deed. I needed to recover the funds simultaneously while proving the fraud. I needed them to hand me the rope. I started by calling my personal estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who had drafted my will. I laid out the evidence. I showed her the TransUnion logs, the LLC registration, and the forged remote notary stamp. "We can file an injunction," Sarah said, visibly appalled. "We can freeze the LLC accounts." "Not yet," I told her. "If we freeze it without cornering them, they will claim the LLC was a legitimate investment vehicle and tie this up in civil court for years. I want to trigger a title event. I want to force them to try and clear the lien themselves." I explained my strategy. Sarah smiled a sharp, predatory grin. "Rick, you are a very dangerous man when you're quiet." The trap began with a simple phone call to Chloe. I waited until I knew she was at work sitting at her desk. "Hi, sweetie," I said, putting on my best tired, slightly confused, old man voice. "Listen, your mother and I have been talking. My blood pressure hasn't been great lately, and I'm starting to think about the future. We've decided we want to protect the house from any future nursing home costs or probate." "Oh," Chloe's voice carried a sudden sharp edge of caution. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I'm meeting with a trust attorney," I said smoothly. "We are going to transfer the deed of the house into an irrevocable family trust. You and Todd will be the primary beneficiaries. But my lawyer said before we can transfer the property, she has to pull a complete, deep-level title search on the house next Tuesday to ensure there are absolutely no encumbrances or clouds on the title." Silence. Complete suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head, the sudden spike of sheer, unadulterated panic. She knew exactly what a deep title search meant. The lawyer would instantly see the $250,000 deed of trust recorded to Apex Funding. "Dad," Chloe stammered, her voice suddenly an octave higher. Are you sure you want to do that? Trusts are so complicated, it might not be necessary." "No, I'm quite firm on it," I said cheerfully. "The title search happens Tuesday. We sign the final transfer papers on Friday at Sarah's office. I'd love for you and Todd to be there to sign as the beneficiaries." I hung up the phone and waited. Imagine sitting across from someone who is actively trying to cover up stealing your life savings. Could you keep a straight face? Could you play the fool? Let me know in the comments. Over the next 48 hours, the panic on their end manifested exactly as I predicted. Steve, my forensic accountant friend, kept a quiet watch on the recorded documents at the county level. Todd and Chloe were trapped. If the title search happened on Tuesday, the fraud would be exposed. They had only one way out. They had to pay off the Apex loan immediately and get a release of lien recorded before my supposed lawyer looked at the title. And to pay it off, they had to move the money out of the Fulton Ventures LLC account and wire it back to Apex Funding. On Monday morning, just 24 hours before my fake title search deadline, Todd initiated a wire transfer of $245,000 from Fulton Ventures directly to Apex Funding to clear the mortgage. He was returning the stolen money to hide the crime. But Todd didn't know that my lawyer Sarah had spent the weekend drafting an ex parte emergency injunction. The moment Todd's wire transfer hit the banking network, Sarah filed the paperwork with a sympathetic judge we had thoroughly briefed. The wire transfer was frozen mid-transit. Todd didn't have the money. Apex Funding didn't have the money. The funds were locked in a judicial holding account fully securing my home's equity, while the forged lien remained actively sitting on the county records. The trap had slammed completely shut, and they had absolutely no idea the locks had changed. Friday afternoon arrived, the day of the supposed trust signing. I told Elaine I was going to the lawyer's office to handle some routine estate planning, and that I would be home for dinner. I wanted to protect her from the ugliness of what was about to happen. I sat in the heavy leather chair in Sarah's conference room. The mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. At exactly 2 o'clock, the receptionist opened the glass door, and Chloe and Todd walked in. They looked exhausted but deeply relieved. They believed they had successfully wired the money back, paid off the loan, and hidden their tracks just in time. Todd was wearing his signature puffer vest, looking confident. Chloe offered a tight, anxious smile. "Hi, Dad," Chloe said, taking a seat across from me. "Ready to sign the trust?" "I am," I said calmly. I kept my hands folded on the table. "But there's a small issue we need to clear up first." Sarah, my attorney, didn't hand them a thick stack of trust documents. Instead, she slid a single, thin manila folder across the table. Todd opened it. Inside were 3 pieces of paper. The first was the certified copy of the forged Apex Funding deed of trust. The second was the IP log showing the digital signature originated from Chloe's home network. The third was the judicial order freezing the $245,000 he had tried to wire on Monday. I watched the physical transformation of a man, realizing his life is over. Todd's smugness didn't just fade, it shattered. He stopped breathing. His hands began to tremble so violently that the papers rattled against the table. He looked at the judicial freeze order, the legal terminology finally penetrating his arrogance. Chloe leaned over to look. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. "Dad," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "What is this? This must be the identity theft I warned you about." I leaned forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who had spent 40 years destroying fraudsters for a living. "Do not insult my intelligence, Chloe," I said softly. "And do not ever use the word dad to me again while you are actively trying to steal the roof over your mother's head." Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. "I know everything," I continued, ticking the points off on my fingers. "I know you unfroze my TransUnion file. I know you used your broker portal to push the underwriting. I know you used a remote notary named Marcus Vance, who, by the way, has already been contacted by the Florida Secretary of State and confessed to remote stamping without verifying my physical ID. And I know the money went to Fulton Ventures." Todd stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. "This is a misunderstanding. We were going to invest it for you. We were protecting it." "Sit down," Sarah snapped, her voice like a whip. Todd slowly sank back into his chair. "The funds you tried to wire back are frozen by a federal judge," Sarah explained coldly. "Apex Funding has been notified of the title fraud. They are calling the loan due immediately and voiding the lien on Richard's property. The money in the judicial hold will be returned to them to make them whole. Richard loses nothing." But what about us?" Chloe stammered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Real tears this time, tears of consequence. "My office has already forwarded the complete file, including the IP logs and the digital notary confession, to the State Attorney General's Division of Financial Crimes, as well as the State Mortgage Licensing Board," Sarah said. Chloe buried her face in her hands, letting out a raw, guttural sob. She knew what that meant. Her career in finance was permanently over. She would be stripped of her licensing, barred from the industry, and likely facing felony wire fraud charges. Todd was looking at the door, his eyes darting frantically, like a trapped animal realizing the cage was locked. "You didn't have to do this," Chloe wept, looking up at me. "We put the money back. We were putting it back. You could have just talked to us." "You didn't put it back out of guilt," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "You put it back because you thought you were about to be caught. You sat at my dining room table, ate the food your mother cooked, and looked me in the eye while my home was carrying a $250,000 forged lien. You crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." I walked toward the door. I paused with my hand on the glass handle and looked back at them one last time. "Do not contact my wife," I said. "Do not come to our home. If I see either of you on my property, the local police will enforce the trespassing order I filed this morning." I walked out of the office, leaving them sitting in the ruins of their own greed. The aftermath was a difficult, painful season for our family. The legal unwinding worked perfectly. Because the funds were frozen and intercepted, Apex Funding was made whole, and they willingly signed a full release of lien wiping the fraudulent mortgage from my property's title history. The house was safe. The state authorities, however, were not nearly as forgiving as a father might have been. The state attorney general pursued the case aggressively. Chloe lost her mortgage broker license permanently and pleaded down to a lesser felony to avoid prison time, receiving heavy probation and community service. Todd wasn't so lucky. Because he was the registered agent of the LLC that received the wired funds across state lines, he was indicted for federal wire fraud. His fancy leased SUV was repossessed, his fitness center collapsed, and he is currently serving an 18-month sentence in a minimum security facility. Their marriage, built entirely on financial ambition and corner-cutting, dissolved shortly after his indictment. The hardest part was telling Elaine. When I went home that Friday evening and sat her down in the living room, I laid out the entire story. Only I showed her the documents. I explained what I had spent the last 2 weeks doing. Elaine wept. She wept for days. The grief of losing a daughter to greed is a very specific, hollow kind of pain. It feels like a death where the person is still walking around. But Elaine is a strong woman. She saw the reality of what Chloe was willing to do to us, and she agreed that we had to protect ourselves. We changed the locks on the craftsman house. We installed a security system. We completely cut contact with Chloe. It has been 2 years since that nightmare ended. I'm sitting on my wraparound porch right now. The sun is setting, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. Elaine is out in the yard tending to her hydrangeas, humming a song I've heard her sing 1,000 times. The house behind me is quiet, sturdy, and most importantly, ours. People often ask how I survived a betrayal that deep without losing my mind. The truth is, my career taught me a vital lesson long before my daughter tried to apply it to me. Trust is a beautiful thing. It is the foundation of a family. But blind trust without verification, trust that ignores the warning signs out of politeness, that is a liability. As we get older, we are conditioned to believe that our children will naturally step into the role of protectors. We want to believe that the people we raised will honor our vulnerability. But aging does not mean we must surrender our autonomy, and asking for help should never mean handing over the keys to your survival. I was lucky. I had the professional experience to see the microscopic threads of the trap before it snapped shut. But how many seniors don't? How many parents lose everything they've built simply because they couldn't imagine their own flesh and blood holding the knife? Kindness is not weakness, and holding a firm boundary is not a lack of love. It is the preservation of your dignity. I lost a daughter, yes, but I kept my home, I protected my wife, and I maintained my self-respect. And in the end, that is a trade I would make again every single time. Has someone you trusted ever made you question everything you thought you knew about them? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories matter, and sometimes sharing them is the only way we heal. If you found some value in this story, please consider subscribing and returning for the next one. Take care of yourselves, check your records, and never be afraid to look closely at the things people try to hide.